Jason X, The Experiment, Chapter 16. Frustration burned in him like acid. It turned to hatred and remained trapped inside of him, which made the burning even worse. He was now secured to a plain, flat surface contained in a framework, and propped up in a near vertical position. It gave him a good view of that woman bustling around her office alone. He watched as she heaved the glass partition back into place. He would not have thought she was strong enough to do it without help. After a while, he understood that she was showing off for him. When she finished with her office, she came into the lab and began talking to him as she moved around busily. He could sense pleasure coming from her as well, as a state of excitement, even arousal. And he knew it was because of what he had done, when that immobilizing force, whatever it was, had finally let go of him, at least for a little while. That didn't make him any less hostile to her, however. Why she felt pleasure, or for that matter anything else in her life, had nothing to do with him. If she was pleased by what he was, what he did, and or how he did it, that didn't change the fact that she was life, and he was anti-life, and she had to go. Oddly, she didn't seem to have even the faintest inkling about the unalterable state of fundamental opposition that was the essence of their existence. It was odd because there was so much that she did know, especially about him. Or rather, his genesis. She had gone poking inside his head, literally. Poking, prodding, exploring, searching, for nothing in particular, and anything she could find. She had done something to him with her tools. Plugged things into him that had somehow made his memory explode with pictures. Suddenly he had been seeing people and places and events that he had never, ever wanted to see again. But she had done it all in a way so that she could look at them too. Worse, she had figured out how she could keep them for herself, so that she could see them again and again whenever she wanted. But the worst thing of all was that she could make him see them again and again too, whenever she wanted, whether he wanted to or not. Master Sergeant Black Carroll was one of those compact, muscular people who tend to look smaller than they actually are. She had agreed to serve as the Grunt's commanding officer in the complex only after obtaining an ironclad, unbreakable agreement from top command, that when the assignment was completed she would be sent immediately and without delay to ATA, Assassin Training Academy, had been her dream from the moment she had entered the military, and she had known it would take some time for her to get there, given her education, which was 0, possibly a little less. She was not ashamed of the fact that she had arrived at the new recruit clearinghouse utterly illiterate and ignorant of almost everything beyond the most basic social graces, malnourished and lousy with a wide variety of bugs she couldn't name. She didn't make a point of bragging about the fact that she had had to spend 6 months in remedial education before she qualified for boot camp. But if anyone made a point of asking, she didn't lie about it or try to gloss over anything. This course of action did not always end up convincing some shithead who had been trying to humiliate her that she was actually worthy of respect. But it had worked pretty well on the vast majority of people she came into contact with. These days, Master Sergeant Carroll seldom encountered anyone who treated her as if she were stupid. On those occasions when she did, however, she never took it personally. Stupid people with something to hide treated everybody like that. Even stupid people who should have been smart enough to know better, like Dr. Stein. She stood at parade rest, careful to keep her face composed in the appropriate neutral but attentive expression, and her eyes focused straight ahead, while Dr. Stein tried to stare her down. The room they were in was Stein's office, not the one where she actually did any work. This was where she called staff meetings and had people present reports to visiting representatives from command. It was a nice, big, airy room, complete with simulated daylight that could fool anyone into thinking they weren't at least 500 feet underground. It was able to accommodate at least 24 people for the sake of almost any sort of formal meeting or gathering. Right now, however, it was just the two of them. Not much in the way of a gathering, but the occasion was definitely formal. Dr. Stein was formally addressing her as if she were stupid while she stood in the formal position of parade rest. Very, very formal indeed. But nothing to take personally. If you were stupid, you got offended. But if you had a lick of sense, you got suspicious. I do acknowledge that you held no responsibility for the 3 interns currently under house arrest, Stein was saying, and technically you still don't. However, I feel it's necessary, considering that they were selected from the ranks of the, grunts, to deal with them as military personnel. What is it you would like me to do with them, Dr. Stein? Carol asked, keeping her gaze fixed on a point several feet above the woman's head on the wall behind her. Well, nothing actually. Stein moved slightly from side to side in Carol's lower peripheral vision, as if she were trying to force her to look down at her. I'm just informing you of how I have decided to proceed, with the interns and with Corporal Nen. Carol came to full attention. Dr. Stein, with all due respect for your position as head of the project, I request that Linda Newmanen be transferred from wherever you are holding her to the military station where... I thought I made it clear why I can't do that, Stein said in a maddeningly stubborn, patient voice. The corporal has, by her actions, made herself a serious security risk. I have no other choice but to keep her in solitary confinement until further notice, which is to say indefinitely, which means, in all likelihood, until the project here is finished. There was a pause. There's nothing I can do. She brought this on herself. Black Carol cleared her throat. Ma'am, I am fully aware that Command has given you unlimited authority over every aspect of this project. However, I can guarantee that all of us grunts have pledged ourselves to live and die by a code that... I only called you here as a courtesy, Stein said, her tone flat and final now. I wasn't actually obligated to tell you anything, except that I had relieved Corporal Newmanen of her duties and removed her from the project. I would appreciate it if you would assign a replacement for Corporal Newmanen with all due haste. Make it someone who can take the work more seriously, or at least seriously enough to remain fully dressed. Carol felt the silence in the room stretch, and then realized belatedly that Stein was waiting for her to answer. Yes, ma'am, she said, keeping her tone smooth and unhurried. Thank you. Stein let out a long, breathy sigh. Dismissed. Black Carol did her best parade ground about face and marched out of the room. She kept marching down one hallway after another, taking the long route to Center Point where, instead of ringing for an elevator, she marched down 72 flights to the barracks. Supreme Allah hung up and turned to Ramirez Gold. That was Black Carol. She couldn't do anything either, not even about the grunt directly under her command. And no one can find out anything? Gold said in total disbelief. I find it impossible to believe that. In a place where we're under such goddamn heavy surveillance, we actually can't find out something? We are the ones under surveillance, not the ones surveying, Supreme Allah told him, the tone in his voice as ominous as it was admonishing. Count yourself fortunate that you even know where you are. Gold looked at him sharply. Do I? Do you? I mean, really? For absolute certain? Point taken, said Supreme Allah, his dark face grave. All at once, I have a clear understanding as to why Gunnar Gottman sometimes goes about this complex naked. Gold gave a harsh laugh with no humor in it. For that matter, why are we even bothering? Stein's probably got us bugged right now. She probably knows everything any of us have ever... Supreme Allah shook his head. There are ways to tell if surveillance is all pervasive. I can tell you for true that it is not. And in those places where it is, but should not be. He spread his hands, smiling a little. Where their will is, there is a way around it. The scientist appeared alarmed. But if you block their surveillances, they'll know. Don't you see? They'll know what we know. And they'll know that we know. And what will they do? Supreme Allah was amused. Own up to their illegal over-surveillance and demand we cooperate anyways? Surrender all privacy? He shook his head. No, my friend. The military will try to look and listen where it shouldn't, but it will never admit to doing so any more than it would admit either to failure or success. And think it out a little further. Who could be reviewing all the illegal surveillance? The military? Command has more immediate problems to deal with. With neither the time nor the manpower themselves, they would have the job it out. Only there is no one they could trust. No individual, no group of individuals, even within the military itself. Ultimately, full saturation surveillance would be a waste of money and resources. Personally, I think it's more likely that Dr. Stein herself would try such a thing. She has never been troubled by respect for human life. She never actually seen people as anything other than skin bags with varying degrees of mobility. You're not telling me anything I don't know, Gold said darkly. Supreme Allah dipped his head in a non-committal way. I should hope not, as I would be extremely upset if I were. In any case, Dr. Stein has no substantial interest in people other than how they can be useful to her. If she suspected that one or more of the people in the complex were involved in some kind of active opposition to her, she would react without hesitation. But just to monitor? That would mean hours of her precious time and attention squandered on skin bags, other than the clones and the growth vats. If she really were willing to do that, do you think Gunnar Gottman would still be free to trot bare ass between the gym and his apartment? Suprema Law said. Gold interjected. You sound pretty sure of yourself, Gold frowned, but as good as your theory is, I'm not convinced. I have more than a theory to be sure of, Suprema Law told him. There's hardware, too. Gold still looked unimpressed. Yeah, I've got hardware, too. Everybody does. Too bad we don't have any that could tell us what happened to the sex maniacs and their girlfriend. He made a disgusted noise. I told you, they weren't right for the job. Man, without the sex maniacs, it just doesn't feel like breakfast, Devon said. The dismay on his face looked genuine. Zelda wasn't sure whether she felt relieved at being able to drink her coffee without having to studiously ignore the usual double entendres flying thick and fast around her, or disconcerted by this new disappearance. Correction, absence, she told herself firmly, holding the large mug under her nose with both hands so she could savor the aroma. There was absolutely no reason to think of the sex maniac's failure to show up for breakfast as a disappearance. They were merely absent, and that didn't have to mean anything sinister. Given their well-known proclivities, all it probably meant was they had decided to have breakfast in bed. But it was kind of weird without them. Peaceful, but weird. All three of them? Roz said, looking thoughtfully at the empty chairs to Zelda's right. Am I going to be the first one to say LeBlanc? Who's LeBlanc? Asked the new intern. The tone of offhand curiosity in her voice sounded false to Zelda. The guy you replaced, Devin told her. Started out here with us, and then one morning he was just gone, like he'd never been. You didn't happen to run into him on his way out of here while you were coming in, did you? The new intern regarded him with a faint smile. No, but maybe I missed him because he went out through the parking garage. I didn't bring a car myself. Devon sat up straight and opened his mouth to say something, but Fredo talked over him. Save it, Dev, he said, speaking just a little too loudly. Several of the black and gold braids flew up and whipped the hair as Devon's head snapped around to look at him. I was just... Forget it, Fredo told him. Devon made a disgusted noise and turned back to the new intern. Did you know LeBlanc? He stuck a finger in his right ear to shut out anything else Fredo said. Seriously, did you ever meet him? How would she? Zelda snapped impatiently. She didn't get here until after he left. LeBlanc wasn't a trained grunt like the maniacs, Devon said. He came out of a civilian project. So did she. He jerked his chin at the new intern. So maybe she worked with him in some other lab before we all got buried alive, like you and Fredo. Leave me out of this, Fredo said tensely, and just drop the whole goddamn thing. Devon looked from Zelda to Fredo and back to Zelda again. What the fuck is the problem with you two? I try to ask someone a simple question. You were going to try to make some kind of major shit mountain out of the answer, no matter what it was, Zelda said. We're all used to your paranoid fantasies, but she hasn't even been here a week. I was just trying to spare her at least for a little while. I think she had enough of your crap yesterday. Devon sat back in his chair, looking around at everyone else with a mixture of surprise and hurt. No one else said anything. Most of the other interns had suddenly become utterly fascinated by something on the table directly in front of them. Except for Roz, who was sitting on Devon's left and had spent the entire time studying him with unabashed interest. Finally, he sensed her gaze and stared back at her. What? He said finally, his voice sounding both nervous and defiant. We could just ask Suprema Law, she said calmly. Devon made a single barking noise that failed to be a laugh, even a sarcastic one. And have him lie to us? Okay. How can you automatically assume he would do that? Roz replied, calmer and more reasonable than ever. Rastas are the most honest people I know. I don't think they're allowed to lie. It's against their religion or something. It's against all religions to lie, Galena piped up, surprising everyone. She was a tall, rangy woman with reddish-orange hair and a slightly weathered look to her skin. She seldom did more than sit with her chin on her fist and stare silently into her coffee. This morning she was sitting next to the empty chair Alonzo usually occupied, and from time to time she would glance at it sadly. But that doesn't seem to stop anybody, even the most devout. But we're talking about Supreme Allah, Roz said. And what are you saying about him? He propped the swinging door open with his right foot crossed casually behind his left ankle and looked around at all the startled faces with his usual air of benign authority. Zelda could see Roz in her peripheral vision and thought that it was something of a wonder that her blush wasn't actually audible. "That you're honest?" Roz blurted. "That you would always tell us the truth no matter what." "And what do you want to know the truth about?" Supreme Allah asked, still benign. Roz looked pointedly at the three empty chairs. Supreme Allah nodded, his expression turning weary. "They are under house arrest," he said, sighing a little. "It happens when you break the rules." Zelda could actually feel most of the tension in the room dissolve as everyone slumped virtually in unison. "Is that all?" Supreme Allah asked, looking around again. Without waiting for an answer, he beckoned to the new intern, and then, almost as an afterthought, Fredo. "Okay, how many days in a row is that?" Devon said after they left. "They can't really still be training her. And how does it involve Fredo all of a sudden? What's really going on with that shit?" Ondine threw a half-eaten slice of toast at him, which triggered a general fusillade. Covering his head with both arms, Devon yelled that he was kidding. He was just kidding, goddammit. If he really was, Zelda thought, maybe he shouldn't have been. Having to switch from night shift to day shift without any transition was just about the shittiest kind of deal Dan Newmanen could think of. Even if he was running on the best anti-lag meds in the world, the shit quotient was unacceptable. Anti-lag would keep him going, but it never completely got rid of that feeling of something nasty swirling around in the pit of his stomach. It was supposed to. That really good stuff they gave you here in the complex was supposed to smooth out all the rough edges, but it never did for him. It just kind of damped it down, more sometimes than other times. It might get very, very faint, but it was still there. And the only way he could get rid of it was to sleep it off. He really hated that feeling, that up-all-night, watery eyes, acid stomach feeling. There was something about it that made him feel depressed as all fucking hell. And he'd have to watch himself so that he didn't say or do something he'd be sorry for later. Like what a shitty way this was to treat him after he'd taken care of those 3 interns with no one to help him. He hadn't argued with Dr. Stein when she'd called and ordered him to take those guys into custody all by himself. He could have argued, arresting anybody, especially more than one person, during the commission of a criminal act, was one of those things you never did without backup, even if nobody was armed and the crime was not violent. And that wasn't even taking into account the fact that he shouldn't have been making the arrest in this case. If he'd discovered the crime himself, then he could have taken action right on the spot. But the crime being already in progress, he was technically supposed to call the designated MPs. But Dr. Stein had said no because she needed him to handle everything all on his own for reasons that had to do with security. The 3 interns had broken into the office on the floor directly above hers, trying to get at the data in her files. She wanted them tranked, isolated, all in one room was fine, she said, and invisible. Nothing in any of the logs about it. Not a word to anyone, not even the Sarge. And he had done just what she wanted, all the way down the line. Unlocked the control panel in the hall, sealed off the vents, and gassed them to sleep. Turned out they were those guys that everybody called the sex maniacs. Horniest guys Dan Newmanen had ever met. That was for sure. But that was okay. It had been one of them that had come up with the subroutine for ducking out the trapdoor in the Hollow games. Dan Newmanen, or Dan Nin as people called him, had done a deal with him to put the subroutine on chips and make them available to a select clientele at a reasonable price. Either money or barter, or a combination of the two. In his experience, it paid to be flexible, both in terms of profits and in good feelings all around. He had no good feelings about having to put the sex maniacs in isolation, though. Not that he hesitated to do what Dr. Stein told him, or even thought of questioning her orders. But geez, he really wished he knew what they'd done to get themselves in this kind of deep shit. If he'd still been in the barracks, he probably would have gotten wind of whatever they'd been planning, and maybe he'd have been able to talk them out of it. Or maybe they'd have talked him into it instead. Then there would have been 4 guys stashed away, and someone else would be doing this job and enjoying his private room. Dr. Stein had given him access code for one of the med supply rooms so he could get a gurney to transport them. Just by chance, he'd found a mortuary cart with shelves.
That had saved him from having to make 3 trips between the office and the isolation chamber Dr. Stein had told him to use. But geez, it sure had been hard to push that cart with 3 guys on it. A lot harder than he'd expected. And it was a good thing all 3 interns had been unconscious, because they probably wouldn't have appreciated being laid out on a mortuary cart when they were still alive. He'd done it all, everything Dr. Stein had wanted, just the way she wanted, and he hadn't said so much as boo to a goose. Not even boo to his face in the mirror, just because Dr. Stein had been counting on his control. She'd come right out and told him so. Right now, though, he felt like he might be reaching the limit of his control. It seemed like everything was getting so complicated. He didn't really understand the situation, and he didn't want to. Which is why it was starting to get on his nerves so bad. If he'd been feeling even halfway decent, he would have just stood there and turned them all out. Dr. Gottmund and the intern's boss, the Rasta, and Dr. Stein and that new intern. Although, to be fair, the new girl wasn't talking too much. It was mainly Gottmund trying to give Dr. Stein a lot of shit, and the Rastafarian giving them both shit. Alright, they're in the main room of the laboratory so anyone could hear. How many ways do I have to put it, Gunner? Dr. Stein looked down her nose at Gottmund as if from a great height, which was a pretty cool trick considering the guy was actually a couple inches taller than she was. Heavier, too. But Dr. Stein didn't look small next to him. I am no longer concerned about what infection this intern may or may not have given the grunts. They have been returned to quarantine. The infection will run its course. But you said, and I've countermanded that. We have a great deal to do, and I've decided that this is not the best use of our time and resources. But she still brought in an infection from outside that nobody caught, insisted Gottmund. I think that's important enough to... If the infection is now contained, then no, it isn't important enough to think about. Dr. Stein's lab coat rustled dryly as she folded her arms. She had little stick arms with hardly any flesh on them. Gunner, listen to me. I don't care about her. Is that clear? Newman glanced around furtively. The audience of scientists, interns, and grunts had gotten about as big as it could get, where they were now. If Gottmund wanted to go on arguing, they were all going to have to move to the gym or the swimming pool or something. With all due respect, Doctor, Gottmund said, his tone all stiff and offended, I've sent some of her blood down to Haddad O'Reilly in the clinic for a preliminary analysis. It seems to me that we should also take an assortment of tissue samples as well as... Take what you want, Dr. Stein said, sounding biased. Just as long as there's enough of her left so she can do her job properly. But wait till her shift's done. I don't want us tying up anyone else any longer than we already have. Nin straightened up sharply as the woman suddenly turned to look at him. You, Newmanin, go back to your sergeant and tell her you'll be reporting directly to me until further notice, she ordered him. And while you're at it, remind her that I'm still waiting for Linda Newmanin's replacement. She started to turn away when his name tag snagged her attention. Ah, you and she are both Newmanin. As I like to say, Nen. She's my sister, ma'am, he said, wondering what the hell was going on with Stein all of a sudden. She knew damn well what his name was. She called him by it every day, Nan, Newmanin, whatever she felt like at the time, several times a day. My twin sister, ma'am. Dr. Stein hesitated and then gave a careless shrug. Doesn't matter. Just do as I told you. Now. Yes, ma'am. He didn't bother with the proper about-face as he left. No one seemed to notice or care. It wasn't really anything weird. One grunt taking over another grunt's duties. Not even someone replacing Linda. But after all that covert op shit he'd done for Dr. Stein, he couldn't help feeling like there was something weird going on. Something weird, or even bad. Like someone was replacing Linda, not because she had been reassigned, but because something had happened to her. His heart was beating just a little too hard and too fast for normal as he remembered what he'd found in that office with those 3 interns. Nothing that looked like anything that could have belonged to Dr. Stein, only a midnight blue jumpsuit, size large. Someone had worn it recently. It smelled faintly of talcum powder and natural musk, but wouldn't have fit any of them very well. It seemed like it might have fit someone Linda's size, though, and she would have liked the color. Maybe Linda was just sick, he thought, trying to will his heart to slow down even as he walked a little faster down the hallway toward the elevators. Caught a cold. Maybe from somebody she had something going on with. He wasn't actually privy to Linda's list of social contacts, but she usually had something going on with somebody. What if it was one of those interns, or all three? What if they'd done something to her? What if Dr. Stein knew what they'd done, and that was why she wanted them locked away, so she could deal with them? You'll be reporting to me until further notice? Or she was going to let him do that? God damn, he thought. Even if he wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, he was smart enough to know he was right about Dr. Stein. She really wasn't a very nice person. Thank God she liked him. Chapter 17. I absolutely detest the moron Numenon, Stein thought, looking at the interns lying unconscious on the morgue trays. He had probably thought he'd been clever transporting all three at once, but with his limited intellect, it would have never occurred to him that the trays should have been swapped for beds, or at least gurneys. Trays were for dead lumps of flesh. They had no monitoring equipment, no place to attach even a simple IV bag, or a catheter receptacle, and no proper restraints. She really should have remembered that every time she told him to do something more complicated than scratch his moron ass, she had to spell the whole thing out for him. Just her luck that he was the only one in the complex she felt she could trust. Obviously, there was no God. A second after the door slid shut and resealed itself, Alonzo lifted his head. "Is she gone?" he whispered. Powell groaned. "Well, if she wasn't, we'd sure know by now." He sat up, looking down at the wrist loops on the tray with distaste. Morgue trays. I guess we know what she's got in mind for us. Cray started to sit up and then lay down again almost immediately. "How long have we been here?" "No idea," Powell said. "I think I've been awake the longest, but I'm just guessing." "Any guesses as to what happened to Linda?" said Alonzo, raising himself up on one elbow. Powell shook his head. "Ask me an easy one, like why there's obviously no surveillance in this room." "It's an isolation cell," said Cray, speaking slowly. "That's not an explanation," Powell replied. "I wasn't done." Cray rolled his head around to look at him. "I'm still all fucked up from the gas. I got a really low tolerance. I meant, she doesn't want anyone to know we're here. She put us under surveillance. It'll register in the system." "She doesn't have to use the system," said Alonzo. "She can use a private frequency audio bug." "No, it'll show up," Cray insisted, slurring his words a little. "Security system will pick it up. And if it shows up as new, the system will automatically query it. She doesn't want anyone to know we're here." "You think she brought us here herself?" asked Powell. But Cray's eyes rolled upwards as his lids fluttered and closed. Powell was only dimly aware of Alonzo saying something unintelligible in a thick, sleepy voice as everything went dark. "That ungrateful bitch!" Gunnar Gottman sat in the whirlpool with his head back and his eyes closed, trying to bring himself to a state of mind that would allow him to enjoy the feel of the water on his naked body. That ungrateful, probably bipolar, seemingly borderline, and definitely frigid bitch. He managed to compel a blood sample from the new intern, then made Supreme Dreadlocks bring the girl right to her in person. And what does Stein do? Announce she doesn't give a fuck. Steps on his face right in front of the girl, her boss, and a dumbass grunt. What was he supposed to be doing was monitoring the growth of a batch of cells Dr. Bitchenstein said she had modified in some special new way. Like he was a fucking trained ape of an intern and not the youngest doctor of molecular biology in the history of Earth fucking 2. So fuck that. In the world, according to Gunnar Gottman, anything that an intern could do, an intern would do. He'd grab the first one he had run into, a slightly plump, bored-looking girl named Ondine, and assign her to babysit while he worked on lowering his stress. And if Bitchenstein had a problem with that, she could clone his dick and twirl on it. Okay, this has been chapters 16 and 17 of Jason X The Experiment. I hope you're enjoying it so far. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe. Click the like button, drop me a comment. Click the bell so you'll always know when new chapters are dropping. We're almost finished with this book. The chapters are pretty short from here on out. Probably just a couple more uploads and we'll be done. And I'll be moving on to Friday the 13th, Hell Lake, as voted by you guys. I want to again congratulate Derek Lackey for winning the A Nightmare on Elm Street Suffer the Children book giveaway. I'll be getting that to him soon. I hope everybody has a happy and safe Halloween tonight. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, have a good night, and thanks for listening.